Good evening. It's lovely to see you this evening on what is not quite as cold as it has been. So that's lovely, but it's nice and warm in here, an opportunity to come and to share and to understand together. I'm going to be the moderator. My name is Martin Levine, as we've been explained in terms of what Jim has explained to me. I'm the Presbytery Minister, Growth and Mission. And essentially what my role is in that is to look at how the church interacts with community, to look at how we grow our connections with community and how we share in community together. And that's part of what this concept of the Voice Forum is about, is to come and to deal with something which is of community interest. Not only this particular community in Thornley, Hornsby, and Normanhurst, but also in the Sydney and, of course, Australia at large. And I think even to some degree would have an impact on the world and on the way in which First Peoples actually understood around the world, because I think some of what we're doing is going to have impact that will ripple around the world in the connections with that. And so it's important for us to come and to share and to understand and connect with that. What I'm going to ask is that our speakers, as I mentioned them, if they'd like to come forward and take a seat, and then we will then start straight away in sharing together. So the Honourable Julian Leeser, Federal Member for Berowra, who's been journeying in that constitutional connection with First Peoples right from the time that he began. He also was our former Shadow Attorney General and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. Welcome, Julian. It's great to have you with us and to come and to share with us. Thank you. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Nathan Tyson. Nathan's Director of the First Peoples Strategy Engagement of the Uniting Church in New South Wales ACT Synod, and a passionate advocate for the rights and interests of Aboriginal people. Nathan has been doing a lot of these talks lately, which is fantastic, Nathan, so people can hear and can understand and can ask their questions. And please, as our speakers do speak, please do keep your questions in mind, because there will be lots of time for us to do that. And finally, but certainly not least, Edwina O'Brien. She's the Assistant Chaplain and Head of Religion and Ethics and an Aboriginal Studies teacher at the Pymbles Ladies College, and has worked significantly within remote communities. And we thank all our three speakers to come to welcome them tonight on this winter's night, to come and to share and to connect with us. And so to stop me from talking, I'm going to ask if Julian would come forward and come and share his opening address with us.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, Julian. I just got a meaningful look from Nathan, and the meaningful look is, let's do an acknowledgement of country.
Oh, were you? Okay. Thank you. Bit of confusion, but all good. Look, I would just like to very quickly acknowledge that we are on the land of the Darug and Guringai peoples today. My heritage is Anawan and Gomeroi from up around Tingha, Bandara, so I'm not a person from this country, so I can't welcome you officially, but I can certainly acknowledge elders past and present of this place and community members of this place, and pay our respects to them. So thank you for having us here today.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. Let me join you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I also acknowledge my friend Jim Mean? When I think of what reconciliation is all about, I think of the wonderful work Jim did as the moderator of the Uniting Church. When I first met Jim, when I was involved in the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and the board and the Uniting Church were working together to try and understand, so both communities could better understand each other. And I think that the work that Jim did there was really spectacular, and it is in some respects a microcosm of the importance of reconciliation and people coming together and understanding each other better. And so can I pay particular tribute to you, Jim, and thank you for your work in organising this evening. Can I acknowledge Martin, been a wonderful minister at Beecroft Uniting, and Edwina and Nathan. It's wonderful to have you both here. I'm very excited tonight to be in the presence of people in my own electorate, and there's one other person I want to acknowledge, and that is Dorothy Babb, who's been the convener of the Hornsby Area Residents for Reconciliation for many, many years. It's one of the most active reconciliation groups in the country, As I said to my wife, and as I said to Dorothy, when I've been imagining in my own mind what referendum day is going to be like, I've imagined myself standing on a booth with Dorothy handing out yes, how to vote cards. And that image has been in my mind for some years. So Dorothy, thank you for your wonderful work. Tonight's a special night for me because I'll be doing events like this across the electorate and around the country, but this is the very first occasion, public occasion, where I've come to speak to people in my electorate as part of the referendum campaign about my journey and the reasons why I'll be voting yes. I come to this debate as somebody who has a very deep interest in Australia's constitution. I was perhaps an odd child in that I asked my parents not for a BMX bike, which was the fashion in the 1980s, or for the latest computer game, or for a cricket bat for my 10th birthday. Instead, I asked them for a copy of Australia's constitution. I've described myself appropriately as Nerdus Maximus. Why did I do that? I was asked to do a schoolboy project about Australia's Prime Ministers, and I kept hearing this idea of the Australian Constitution. And the Constitution has played such an important part in my life. I'm a lawyer by training. I had the privilege of working as an associate to a Justice of the High Court of Australia. I was an elected delegate to the 1998 Constitutional Convention. I was also appointed by John Howard to the 10-member No Case Committee for the 1999 Republic referendum. I've written books opposing a Bill of Rights. I was the citizens convener for the local government referendum, opposing that referendum. So I'm the sort of person who thinks we've got a great constitution. One of the things about our constitution is a bit like The Voice. It was written in Australia, by Australians, for Australian conditions, and I think it is a document worthy of celebration. So I come to this debate as somebody who has a deep interest in the Constitution. I had the privilege of serving as Shadow Attorney General, where I was responsible for the opposition's policy in relation to the Constitution. And I've chaired several parliamentary committees, including a joint select committee with Pat Dodson on constitutional recognition. That's my background and my interest in the Constitution. How did I come to be interested in this question of the voice? As I say, my starting prospect is that the Constitution is a good document, and it's something that is worthy of celebration. But there's always been something that seemed to be missing from the Australian Constitution, and that was the position of our Indigenous people in the Constitution. They're not mentioned in the Australian Constitution, and that's something that needs to be remedied. In 2014, the Indigenous leader Noel Pearson came to visit me because he was going around the country talking to people who had previously voted no in referenda to try and understand what is it that makes people vote no in referenda, and what might people who have traditionally opposed constitutional change want to see from a constitutional change that involved Indigenous people. And the message I gave Noel was that those of us who think the Constitution's a good document see it as a practical and pragmatic charter of government. It's the rule book of the country. And what I said to him is, if you're going to think about the Constitution, think about what it does. It sets up institutions. It sets up things like the House of Representatives and the Senate. It has the Executive Council, effectively the ministers. I said, if you're going to think about doing something to the Constitution, don't think about putting in a Bill of Rights type provision. That's not our tradition in Australia. Think about something that goes with the grain of the Constitution, which is, establishing institutions. And he went away, and over a period of a year or so, Noel and Greg Craven and myself, Marcia Langton, Megan Davis and others, worked together to produce an idea which became The Voice. And Noel and Megan and Marcia took that idea and worked it through the various constitutional conventions that led up to the Uluru Statement, and asked Indigenous people for the first time in our history, what do you want from constitutional recognition? And what the great surprise for me and the great joy was that constitutional conservatives and Indigenous people were actually on the same page. They didn't think that mere symbolism was the right thing for our constitution. Indigenous people, when they were asked about this, said they wanted a say in the policies and laws that affect them. You might ask, why did they say that? Why does the Uluru Statement talk about voice? I think it's very simple. This is a great country. When you look around at every imaginable social and economic indicator, Australia performs at the top of the world. But we've got a gap in the outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and the rest of the country. And it's a gap that, despite all the goodwill in the world and all the money and the bipartisanship in this area of policy, we just haven't been able to close. And when I've gone around as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and when I've chaired parliamentary committees on Indigenous affairs and you talk to Indigenous people, they often say to me, you know, no one asked me about this. No one sought my view. You know, you people in Canberra think you know best. When you consult people on the policies and laws that affect them, you get better outcomes on the ground. You get buy-in, you get to understand the ground truth of all of these things. Think about it this way. Living in our beautiful part of Sydney in the Hornsby Shire, from time to time we might have a neighbour that decides that they want to build a new house next door to us, or they might want to do alterations and additions. And the council sends us a notification to tell us that's what the neighbours are going to do. We get consulted on that. Now, if somebody came up and whacked a 5-storey building next to us, and nobody asked us, we'd be pretty upset. If they're going to put up a 5-storey building, we can at least, through the consultation the council does, register our objection. We can say to the council, you know, this building is too close to our boundary. It's going to take our sunlight. It's going to take our privacy. And the council can adjust according to the consultation. It's no different in Indigenous policy. If we want to get better outcomes from Indigenous policy in the areas of health, housing, education and employment, we've got to actually talk to people on the ground and understand how we can get better value for the government dollars that are spent. And that's the genius of what is going to be put to us in this year's referendum. This year's referendum does 3 things. It recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. It ensures that we are listening to them about the policies and laws that affect them, and it should deliver better results in education, employment, health and housing. And that should be our great national goal. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Julian. Could you please welcome Nathan, who's going to come and share his first opening address.
Thank you very much. I get the unenviable job of following Julian. Yama, good evening, everybody. What I'm going to use my 10 minutes for is just to run through what are known as the voice design principles that have been put together by the First Nations Referendum Working Group. And I note that these principles have been endorsed by the Prime Minister and the government. So the first principle is the voice will give independent advice to the Parliament and government. The voice would make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The voice would be able to make representations proactively. The voice would be able to respond to requests for representations from the Parliament and the Executive Government. The second principle. The voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities. So members of the voice would be selected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, not appointed by the Executive Government. Members would serve on the voice for a fixed period of time to ensure regular accountability to their communities. Principle 3. The voice will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, be gender balanced and include youth. So members of the voice would be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. Members would be chosen from each of the states and territories and the Torres Strait Islands. The voice would have specific remote representatives as well as representation for mainland Torres Strait Islander people. So I note that principle you might hear some people saying, it'll just be elites from Sydney or the East Coast or that sort of thing. That's not true. The representatives will be from all over Australia, including remote and regional areas. Principle 4, the voice will be empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful and culturally informed. Members of the voice would be expected to connect with and reflect the wishes of their communities. The voice would consult with grassroots communities and regional entities to ensure its representations are informed by their experience, including the experience of those who have historically been excluded from participation. Principle 5, the voice will be accountable and transparent. The voice would be subject to standard governance and reporting requirements to ensure transparency and accountability. Voice members would fall within the scope of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Voice members would be able to be sanctioned or removed for serious misconduct. Nothing particularly surprising, I don't think, in that. Principle 6, the voice will work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures. The voice would respect the work of existing organisations. So the voice would not seek to override or overrule or speak on behalf of those organisations. It would consult with them and, where appropriate and where they seek, would champion their particular views and needs through the voice. Interestingly, the Coalition of Peak Aboriginal Organisations, which represents the interests of about 80 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, has publicly come out and said that they support the voice because they can see the value in the voice. Principle 7, the voice will not have a program delivery function. The voice would be able to make representations about improving programs and services, but would not manage programs, money, or deliver services. Principle 8, and very importantly, the voice will not have a veto power. So from those principles, I think there's some things to remember. The voice members will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The members will not be appointed by the government. There will be representatives on the voice body from regional and remote areas across Australia. The voice will consult with regional and remote communities via the regional and local structure component of the voice. The purpose of the voice is to provide advice, just advice, to help inform the development of laws, policies and programs that will help to address disadvantage impacting First Peoples and to close the gap, as Julian mentioned. The advice from the voice will not be binding on the Parliament or the government. The government can take or leave the advice. The voice will not have a veto power. The voice cannot cancel, overturn or override decisions of the Parliament or the executive government. So I have heard some people say, oh, the voice will destroy our parliamentary process or destroy our democracy. Our parliamentary process and our government decision-making process will run as it always has. The voice will simply provide good and practical advice based on consultation to help, hopefully, the government and the Parliament make better and more effective laws, policies and programs to help close the gap. I hear a lot of people talking about the detail of the voice. Interestingly, the detail of the voice will be created by the enabling legislation that will be proposed in draft form to the Parliament. It'll be debated, it'll be subject to amendment and will need to be approved by both Houses of Parliament. All elected MPs and senators will have the opportunity to comment on and to debate the draft legislation and to contribute to determining the final details of that legislation. The voice legislation could also be amended by Parliament over time to accommodate changes in social context or other unforeseen factors that arise. And I often hear people saying, but you already have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament. Yes, we do, and they're wonderful role models for the most part. I can't, anyway. I won't go there, it's only 10 minutes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament are elected by and accountable to their electorate, and in most cases, unless they're an independent, must abide by the policy decisions and approaches of their party. They are not elected by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community to represent the interests of those communities. And that's the difference between the voice representatives and our wonderful parliamentarians. I've also heard people talk about the National Indigenous Australians Agency and say, but you've already got the National Indigenous Australians Agency. The National Indigenous Australians Agency is a government agency responsible to a minister, subject to direction by the minister and the government, and is not an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body. The voice body will be an independent body able to give frank and fearless advice to the government and to Parliament, and will not be subject to the direction of a particular minister. So there's a difference in those two things. I often hear people talk about why can't you just legislate a body? So we have had ATSIC and we have had the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, bodies created by legislation and ultimately bodies abolished by abolishing the legislation. The voice is about providing a secure and long-term mechanism to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities to provide frank and fearless advice to Parliament and government. The issues of disadvantage are entrenched and will not be fixed in a year or two. We are going to need time to address these problems effectively. The body that's providing advice on how to do that needs security of tenure. The voice is about developing and implementing better laws, policies and programs to address issues of entrenched and endemic disadvantage that impact people, families and communities. And interestingly, as we know, voice provisions can be inserted into the Constitution via a referendum. The voice provisions might also be one day removed via a referendum, because I've heard people say, once it's in there, you'll never be able to get rid of it. It's sort of not true. There is a way to remove it if the country at some point decides that they wish to do that. And I've said to people that probably beyond my lifetime, but if we get hopefully to a point where the gap is closed and that disadvantage is addressed, I would be one of the very happy people to say we don't need the voice anymore. We can only hope. I've heard people say that the voice is legally risky, although I don't hear a lot about what the risks actually are. I see a lot of positives and a lot of potential to address disadvantage. So the Voice is an initiative to help close the gap. The Close the Gap reports clearly show that the disparity in socioeconomic data, they show the disparity. The data is very clear, significant, substantial and inequitable disadvantage exists. While the numbers are evidence, I ask that you remember that the numbers relate to people. The Voice is about addressing disadvantage. It is about improving lives and saving lives. In my opinion, people are trying to politicise the Voice, in some ways for political gain or to stir up fear. There's some sky is falling type claims. I think people are deliberately trying to muddy the water a little bit. Please don't be misled. The Voice is just advice, non-binding advice that will help achieve some positive outcomes through more effective laws, policies and programs. The Voice is a modest request and the sky will not fall. Thank you.
To close off this first session in terms of our particular 10-minute talks, I'm going to ask Edwina to come and to share with us.
Thank you very much, and I think it's a bit of a hard act to follow Nathan as well. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about the Voice from, I suppose, an ethical point of view and a bit of a theological or spiritual point of view, and also a little bit from a cultural point of view. And specifically, I'm going to, in a moment, take you through some slides showing you a remote community in the Northern Territory that I've had the great privilege of visiting and having a relationship with through my church in North Turramurra for many, many years now. Just to show you some practical on-the-ground examples of how I think a voice could really make a difference to people's lives. But first I just wanted to start with 4 simple facts. to repeat what I think both Nathan and Julian have said, the Voice is simply an advisory body. It can't initiate policy or legislation. Secondly, unless you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, the Voice will not directly affect your life. It will, I think, be able to really affect for the good Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives, but for the rest of Australians, it won't actually affect your life very much, apart from one way, which I'll speak about later. Thirdly, the gap is widening. What we're doing right now, it's not working. So why not try something? This is an opportunity to try something that I think will actually work. And fourthly, I know that some First Nations people have been arguing that a treaty should come first before a voice. I agree that a treaty is very important. However, at the end of this year, towards the end of this year, we're not voting on a referendum about a treaty. We're voting on a referendum about a voice. This is the opportunity that we have in front of us. And it's a process and it's a journey, and this is the first step in that process that we are being presented with. From a cultural point of view, I would say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are not Western cultures, and I know that a lot of my First Nations friends and colleagues talk about having to live between Western values and their First Nations values in society today. And I think probably one of the biggest differences is that our Western culture is an individualistic culture, whereas First Nations cultures are very, very much based on family and community, and along with that comes consultation. So for Indigenous communities, sitting down and talking things through very carefully with the appropriate community leaders and stakeholders, and actually listening and taking time to do that process is extremely important. But here in Australia, we're governed by a government that belongs to the dominant culture, which is a Western culture. And so over the last 200 years, First Nations peoples have had policies done to them and about them and for them, but according to a set of different cultural values. So I think the Voice is a really important opportunity for communities to be listened to have representation, direct representation, and for programs and policies to be put into place and supported by the government, not by the Voice, but for the government to be advised by the Voice about what policy will definitely not work, what policy they think will work well, or what could be done better with the current policies that do exist in individual communities. And as we know, every time there's a change of government, there's a change in funding, there's a change in policy, and often programs that were running really, really well are suddenly cut, funding is cut. Conversely, thousands of dollars are poured into policies where the communities haven't been consulted, and those programs die a quiet death, and it's a waste of taxpayers' money. So that's the way that I think all Australians will be affected by the Voice, in that that money will not be being wasted all the time because of a lack of consultation. Many of us here tonight are perhaps people of faith. I'm a person of Christian faith. Whether you're a person of Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Baha'i or another faith, all people of faith are called to and instructed to care for and stand up for the voiceless and those who are oppressed. Proverbs 31 tells us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Jesus' second commandment is to love your neighbour as you love yourself. His whole ministry was based on seeking out those who were not part of the dominant culture and letting them know how precious they were to God. So the community of Minyeri, I'll just introduce you to, this community is on Alawa land. And I wanted to just talk to you about just a couple of examples of how I think the voice could make a really practical, on-the-ground difference in terms of land and in terms of health and housing. So Minyeri's there, where the Red Cross is. It's a very remote community of about 400 people. There it is again. And it's a beautiful community. That's a photo of it in quite a green time. This is my good friend Agnes Wilfred. The people in Minyeri are still really strongly connected in a traditional way to their land. Here she's collecting some Spinifex grass to make soap. They still, of course, are living in between the traditional ways and the Western values, but they're still very much connected to their land. And one issue that's come up over the last few years is the threat of fracking on their land, fracking for gas. And I probably run out of time to show you this video tonight, but the people have been fighting against fracking for a long, long time. Their voices haven't been heard. This article that was published in May this year was saying that the Northern Territory Government has approved fracking in the area, despite many, many people in the communities like Minyeri saying no, they don't want it, they're afraid of what it's going to do to the water table and to the land. Another example is housing and health. In 2017, the Northern Territory Government decided that they would demolish the housing in the community and build new houses, but it was managed extremely poorly and people's houses were demolished and then they had to wait 6 months for the new houses to be built. In the meantime, they were camping down by the Billabong here in really, really bad conditions with no clean running water. Those photographs were taken by a teacher at the school who was really distressed at the health outcomes she was seeing. Children were sick. Some children even had to be medevaced out. So just a couple of practical ways that a voice could allow these people in Minyeri and other communities like them to be represented. And I don't want to talk about my friends in Minyeri as victims or as helpless, because they're not. They're tough, strong, funny, great people. But these are some practical ways that I hope will help people to see what a difference a voice could make. And I just wanted to finish with a photo of my 3 beautiful kids, and 3 beautiful kids from Minyeri. And all of these kids, you know, they all deserve the same future. They're all Australians. They all deserve the same opportunities and the same fair Australian society. And I'll just finish with some more words from the Book of Proverbs. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbour, come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you, when you already have it with you. We already have it with us. We have the power to act. We have this opportunity now. So I say let's vote yes to a fairer Australian society. Thank you.
Thank you to Edwina, and of course then to Nathan and to Julian as well for those first opening remarks in this opportunity to share together and to understand a little bit more about what the referendum will be and where we'll go with that. Our next section for this evening is for you, is to be able to ask some questions. You'll see in 3 places there's a microphone set up, and so what we'd like you to do is, if you'd like to ask a question to our panel, they'll just remain where they are, and then they can answer the questions as, if you would like to direct it to a particular person, you're welcome to, but they're all welcome then to respond to that. But the idea with it is to then share your questions and to connect with them together. So if you would like to just thank our 3 panelists, and then if some of you would like to come forward to some of the microphones to ask questions, you're welcome to do that. Let's thank them now. Thank you. Now, can I just ask that as you come to ask your questions, if we could have questions, not essays, that would be lovely, just so that we have more opportunity for others to speak as well. And I will take the opportunity to maybe speed up the question point of the question, if that is the case, or the need. So, thank you.
Good evening, my name is Mal. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I have a question, I think, for Nathan. I'm just interested, and maybe I'm getting a little bit into the detail, but the Voice committee or whatever it is, organisation, will have representatives from around Australia. We have a very sparse land and lots of differential sort of Aboriginal, Indigenous people groups all over the country. How will that be managed? Will that be managed by them to pull that together? And how can we guarantee some balance across that within the Voice itself?
Thank you. Great question. My understanding, based on reading the Calma-Langton report and looking at some of the visual diagrams of the structure of the Voice, is that the Voice will have a local and regional structure that complements the national body. So there will be officers, I imagine, and some staff that will go around the communities to talk about particular issues, whether it be housing, health, employment, etc., to consult with those communities in the various areas across the country, to then feed that feedback up to the national representatives. Obviously 24 people can't get everywhere across the country all the time, so there will need to be a structure that supports that. In terms of the actual advice that might come from that, obviously different issues are going to impact the ground in different areas differently. So what housing issues are like in a particular remote community might be different to how they are in a regional community, might be different to how they are in an urban community. There's nothing to say that the advice that the Voice might give to the government or parliament might include 3 separate areas of advice. So it might be, look, in this particular regional area or remote area, having consulted with these particular communities, these are their issues of concern, these are the challenges, and these are the solutions that they're suggesting. In the regional area, it might be slightly different, and in an urban area, it might be different again. So I think the Voice will be able to, and the representatives will be able to collate that consultation feedback in a way that provides the government and parliament with some options. Because I think we generally know that the one-size-fits-all sort of doesn't work. So we need to be able to tailor things so they will be more effective in the particular places where they hit the ground. Thank you.
Would any of the other like to say anything to that? You happy with that? Okay.
Good evening. My name is Wendell. My question is, with a successful referendum, what happens next? And how long does it take?
Do you want me to take that? Because it will be over to people like me if the referendum is successful. So if the referendum is successful, and I think it's actually important just to go through what is actually the amendment that we're being asked to vote for in the Constitution first. So this is one of the smallest changes that's ever been proposed to the Constitution. I know the No Case says it's one of the biggest changes. That's something I very strongly disagree with. Let me give you an example. We are being asked here to add 1 new section to the Constitution. That's all, 1 new section. In the Republic referendum, there were 69 different changes to the Constitution. 69 changes is a big change. 1 new section is a small change. The section does 3 things. Firstly, it's got a sentence in there that recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. Secondly, it says that there shall be a voice, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, so it is the Parliament asking the people for permission to establish a body. It says that the function of that body will be to make representations on matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to the federal Parliament and the federal executive government, which is the public servants and the ministers. And this is the answer to your question. The third thing it says is that Parliament will effectively have the power to make laws with relation to the composition, functions, processes, powers, procedures of the voice. So after a successful referendum, the Parliament will pass legislation to establish these bodies. The Parliament will pass legislation to confirm who's going to be on the body, how long is their term, what is the funding, what's the priority work of the body, how will people be chosen, what will the various functions of it be, and importantly, how will it receive the representations that have been made to it. So vote first, then legislation next, and then after that legislative process, the voice will be established. And as Nathan said, it's not just one body, we're looking at a system of bodies, local, regional, national.
Anybody else would like to comment? No? Okay. Next question.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you to the speakers tonight too. Very good presentations there. My question is about the wording of the proposed amendment to the Constitution. Now, we've had three very eminent lawyers who have criticised the wording. They've criticised the fact that the wording says that the voice will have the power to make representations to the executive government. The executive government being the public servants in the background of government. Three, Professor Julian Leeser too, Frank Brennan and Professor in the paper this morning anyway, Greg Craven have criticised that. They've said that the wording is flawed, but they're still suggesting that we should vote for the voice. So that to me is illogical. So what? Where is the logic behind that in these experts saying that the wording is flawed, but yes, we want you to vote for it?
Well, Paul, given that you've named me, thank you for the question. I should clarify my position. The reason I was encouraging the amendment of executive power is that I thought, of executive government rather, was that I thought that if it was removed, it would make it more likely for the referendum to pass. That was my reason for encouraging the government to make the amendment. The government didn't adopt those amendments, but I believe that this is a safe change to the Constitution. Look, what do they say as a lawyer? 2 lawyers, 3 opinions. There are many eminent lawyers, including the former Chief Justice of Australia, Robert French, including the former Chief Justice of New South Wales, Tom Bathurst, who support the wording of the Constitution and who say that it is safe. Why is it important that executive government is in the Constitution, and why is it important that the voice is able to make representations to the executive government? The first reason is because executive government is where the action is. Executive government, the public service, the ministers, they're actually the people that make most of the decisions that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on a daily basis. The Parliament itself, we make the laws, but we're not responsible for the administration of those laws. And often it's in the administration of those laws, as the excellent example that was given a minute ago in that house where you saw, they said we're going to demolish houses, and then it took them 6 months to actually get round and build any new houses. That's where many of the problems are. So it's really important that the voice is able to make representations to the executive. Some people say that if this passes, there'll be lots of litigation, and there'll be endless litigation on this. The truth is, any new body that is established in the Constitution is the subject of litigation at some time. The various iterations of the Fair Work Commission, the Industrial Relations Commission, the Industrial Relations Court of Australia, all were challenged on constitutional grounds at some point. And it was the High Court's job to help set the boundaries. That's the court's job in our federation. The argument that is being run by some people on the no case is effectively that this will lead to litigation because if you make a representation to the executive, then the executive will have to consider it, and if people don't like the way it's considered it, they'll run off to the High Court. The reality of what will happen is that the Parliament, in legislating to establish the voice, will say, here is a system by which we will consider those representations. If the public servants consider the representations according to that system, there will be no challenge, or there will be no successful challenge. If the Parliament were to set up a Mickey Mouse system that was not real, the High Court might effectively say that's unconstitutional because it doesn't comply with rule of law principles. But what would then happen is the Parliament would go and set up a new alternative system, or the High Court might, in its judgments, make recommendations about what that system would look like. That is the disaster scenario. And I don't know about you, I don't think that's much of a disaster. I think that is the normal Australian system with Parliament making laws, with the court hearing challenges, with things being worked out, working its way through. There's not going to be a flood of litigation in relation to this. This is an orthodox, simple, safe change.
There's some more questions. Thank you.
Good evening, folks. My name is Liz, and I've been sent along tonight by a friend, with questions from a friend who would dearly love to have been able to be here. Luckily for you, of the three of these questions, two have already been completely answered. But and the third question, the one which I will read and present, has been spoken around, and I'd just like to offer the opportunity for any of you to develop and speak further about. Following the landmark constitutional amendment of 1967, why have we not seen more change with Aboriginal community health and education? But we seem to have seen a lot of money given by the government, by the Commonwealth, to make improvements. Is this money not being fairly distributed to create improvements, or where is this money going?
I'll go first. Thanks, Liz. I think one of the biggest things which I did mention a little bit is the lack of community consultation. So plenty of money has been spent, but when the elders or the traditional owners of communities or the leaders of communities aren't properly consulted and aren't able to have the time to sit down with the rest of their community and figure out what would be the best way to spend that money, that's when things don't work and that's when money gets wasted.
I would encourage people to Google the Productivity Commission. The Productivity Commission's done some really good analysis of money that is spent on Aboriginal things. I often hear this figure of $30 billion sort of, claimed that that's spent on Aboriginal people. What the Productivity Commission has found, and unfortunately I can't remember the exact numbers, but in general what it has found is that a lot of that money goes into effectively the development and management and bureaucracy around programs and the implementation of programs. Not $30 billion hits the ground. A fraction of that eventually hits the ground. So there's a lot of public servants that are paid from that money. There's a lot of program developers and consultants paid from that money to develop programs. So the theory is, and I believe, is that if you're getting advice from the communities that are on the ground about what they need, what they see as the solutions, what they're willing to engage with and to support, when those programs are developed, they're going to be better and they're going to be better received and have better outcomes on the ground. So I said this the other day, it's really important for people to understand that Aboriginal peoples and communities do not like being disadvantaged. I don't really know anyone that probably would like being disadvantaged. So Aboriginal peoples and communities really, really want better outcomes. They want more efficient and effective policies and programs. They want to be living better lives. So Aboriginal people are the first ones to be saying, can you please do this a bit better and spend the money more effectively? And I think all Australians are sort of supportive of that principle. So.
I wanted to give you an example of why the money doesn't get to where it gets, and that's because often, public servants, people of goodwill in Canberra will dream up good ideas or hear a problem but not ground truth it. Classic example from when I was chairing the House Indigenous Affairs Committee, we did an inquiry into food security in remote communities, and we were told that because often food is delivered in bulk in remote communities because it's so far away and it can take a long time to get there, that the food goes off and spoils. And the public servants in Canberra thought, well, this is just good, we've got a simple fix for this, we'll just send more refrigerators to the remote communities and the food will keep longer. It sounds like a terrific idea. It sounds like a really, sensible idea. It's what you'd do if you were living here in Thornley like me. If you needed to store food for a long time, more fridges. Except that the electricity in Thornley here is much better and more reliable than it is in many remote communities. When you're spending money and you're not actually talking to the people who are supposed to benefit by the programs and understanding how those programs are actually going to run on the ground, you waste money. When you talk to those people, you get better value for money because you understand how the program will work on the ground. That's fundamentally all this is about.
Thank you.
Hi, good night. My name is Manuel. Thank you for the opportunity. Given that The Voice, the organization that is going to be The Voice, will not exist when the legislation is being created, is it possible that The Voice will end up being something that we don't intend to? I mean, that the legislation will change things to probably not comply with the principles that you read, or it's something very different at the end because there's no voice, making sure that the voice will be what we think it's going to be? A little bit of chicken and egg problem, I guess.
It's a great question. May I? So one of the things you're going to get in the next few weeks is a booklet that's going to come to every home in Australia. It's called the Yes and No booklet. And it's got the best argument for the yes case and the best argument for the no case there. In the yes case booklet are many of the principles that were articulated there. You could take that as a commitment from government, because government members and others in the parliament like me who support the yes case signed up to it. So if the Australian people vote in favour of The Voice, if we then ended up with a body that didn't look like the things that you'd been told you were getting, people would be pretty angry at the government, and the Australian people would be right to hold the government to account. One of the advantages, though, of not putting everything in the Constitution and being able to legislate is that you can change legislation from time to time. And we might find after a few years that some of the aspects of the way in which The Voice is setting up is not working as it is intended, and we need to make adjustments. Or because, as Nathan said, over time, everyone hopes that The Voice will help us close the gap, and so that The Voice might have a different function. I take a slightly different perspective to Nathan about what would happen with The Voice, in that happy day where we'd close the gap. I think The Voice will always have an important function because, unlike any other Australian, we make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because they're the first people of the country. And there are some laws that have nothing to do with closing the gap, but have everything to do with them being the first people of the country. And those laws have things to do with heritage protection, with the protection of cultural artefacts and so on, with native title. We're always going to need some advice on better ways to make those laws, and so I think there will always be the need for some form of advisory body. But its first order of business is closing the gap. That's what the Minister said, and I thoroughly agree with her there because they are the urgent pressing issues that are on the ground today.
Sorry, Nathan.
Look, I was just going to say a sort of related comment is I often get asked, about what are all the things that The Voice is going to talk about, and are they going to be giving advice on things like submarines and other things? my response to that is that we have some really critical issues impacting our communities. We have issues of chronic disease, we have issues of youth suicide, we have housing issues, we have infrastructure issues. The Voice is going to have limited resources and limited hands on deck. So like any organisation with limited resources, there's going to be a need to consider what the priorities are and to work on and focus on those priorities. So a lot of those other things that maybe could be considered are going to be sort of in the periphery because there's going to be a need to be a very strategic focus.
Thank you.
Thank you each for your presentations, and I agree with many things that each one of you have said. Julian, you've got a deadly tie on. Nathan, you've got a deadly shirt on. And Edwina, there's some pretty deadly shoes. My first questions are for Julian, and then I've got the same question for Nathan and Edwina. Julian, how do you think an Aboriginal person feels when you say the Constitution is a great document and was written by Australians? And I stand here as a woman as well. Women weren't at the table to draft that Constitution. But how do you think we feel when those words are spoken? My other question for you, Julian, is will you support treaty and treaties and a National Truth-Telling Commission, which are the other two central calls of the Uluru Statement from the Heart? And also, as a Member of Parliament, how will you help to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, which we've been waiting for since I was 11 years old? Will I then ask my question, or take it at the same time?
Take it at the same time.
So Nathan and Edwina, my question to you is, how do you think Aboriginal people feel when we hear that the Voice is only, and emphasis on the only, an advisory body? And I did just want to point out, Edwina, that we do not need, and not that you said this, but just for everyone's knowledge here, we do not need a referendum for treaty. That is already currently within the constitutional power under Section 61 of the Constitution. The Parliament already has that power. So just to make sure that that's very clear. Thank you.
Well, that's a very long list of challenging questions, so thank you for those. I do think we have a great constitution. I think the proof of the pudding is that we're one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. The constitution is the work of human beings. Of course, it's not a perfect document. And one of the reasons I'm supporting this referendum is because this referendum completes our constitution. It fills the missing gap that has been there by recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the constitution. When you look at the way Australia's constitution was made, you have to think about it in comparative terms to its time. We had one of the few constitutions where there were democratic elections for a convention, for a series of conventions. Although there were no women who participated in those conventions, there were women who stood as delegates to those conventions, people like Catherine Helen Spence. And in South Australia and in Western Australia, long before women got the vote in Britain or the United States, they actually voted in the referenda to bring forward our constitution. So while the constitution didn't have women working on it, women certainly voted, and women were absolutely active in petitioning and in relation to the campaign. The Australian Women's National League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union played a huge role in the Federation movement and advocated very strongly for the constitution and various provisions in it. So while by the standards of today there wasn't participation, by the standards of its time, this is one of the things why our constitution is so amazing. It was a thoroughly progressive document in its day. And it remains a document that I think has really stood the test of time. But this is the referendum to complete it. In this referendum, I think it's really important. The Uluru Statement makes a series of requests to the Australian people. This referendum is about one of those requests. This is about the Voice. I think it's important that we focus on the fact that it is on the Voice. It is not about the other issues. I don't want to confuse the issue by talking about other issues. I think we need to focus on what is on the table today. If you vote yes to the Voice, that does not necessarily mean you get treaty or truth. If you vote no to the Voice, that also doesn't mean that the government won't proceed with treaty or truth. They are three separate matters. I think it's important that we focus on the voice. The final question was about the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. The Commonwealth, as is my understanding the last time I looked at this, had implemented the recommendations that were its responsibility. The recommendations that remain to be implemented from the Royal Commission are the responsibilities of the states and territories. One of the important recommendations was the notification scheme, which was a scheme that has not been implemented nationally. This is despite a lot of the important lassoing work. I'm trying to think of a better word. The important leadership work of the Commonwealth in trying to encourage the states and the territories to implement a national notification scheme. That is, if an Aboriginal person is put into custody, then that is notified. That's the notion of that scheme. I think we have to do more to continue to ensure that we have no Indigenous deaths in custody. Frankly, other than for natural causes, we should work to a place where we have no deaths in custody. And one of the most important things that we can do there is ensure that Indigenous people aren't going to prison, and that is by doing important projects like Justice Reinvest, which is a project that's run that takes holistic early intervention and ensures that young Indigenous people are in a situation where they're not likely to be in a situation where they're likely to be picked up by the police, because there are important diversionary programs, and there's some very successful examples of that going on today in Western New South Wales.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? My first question...
My poor colleagues, the audience get bored of me. This was a...
My first question was, how do you think an Aboriginal person feels when you say the Constitution is a great document and was written by Australians?
Well, all I can say is what I then said was that this actually completes the Constitution. There's been a missing part of it, and that's why I think this referendum is so important. That's why I gave up my job as the Shadow Attorney-General and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, because I think this is so important that I wanted to campaign for it, because I believe our Constitution needs to be complete.
If we can get to...
I just wanted to add to that point. Julian, I do want to thank you and commend you for the cost of what it has cost you, your shadow ministry. As Aboriginal people, we know the cost of when we stand up and when we speak up. And so I do want to commend you for that and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm proud to stand with you.
I think there was a question around how, I'm not sure if it was how I feel or how people generally feel about the fact that the voice is non-binding. The fact that the voice doesn't have the power to force the government or the parliament to do anything. When I first read about the voice, I've written about this, it's been published, so I can't pretend I didn't, but I wasn't particularly fussed on the voice because it was non-binding. It didn't feel like, to me, like it was enough. I've been an advocate for Aboriginal rights for 30 years, and I was just disappointed that it wasn't a bit more. And I spent a long time thinking about it and wrestling with it. And one day I had sort of this epiphany, which is that, you know, the Uluru Statement talks about voice and treaty and truth, and all of those things are equally important. The voice, in terms of a more substantive sort of thing that can force something, isn't necessarily necessary, in that a lot of the substantive things, sovereignty, land rights, reparations, restorative justice outcomes, those are things that can be negotiated in a treaty. And just so people know, if you look up the Australian government's treaty process, a treaty ultimately would be enacted through legislation. So the outcomes, therefore, would be legislated. So if you hear people saying that, you know, people want to raise cities and have all the land handed back, our parliament's not going to legislate that. So the outcomes will need to be negotiated, and they will not be ridiculous outcomes. But that's in a treaty document. That's where that substantive stuff can happen. I also realised that if if Aboriginal people, and myself particularly, if I wanted a substantive binding voice and we tried to pitch that to the Australian people, it would never happen. It's simply because it would be a third chamber. And I'm a realist, you know, I'm a rights advocate, but I've also got to be real in terms of what's realistically possible. So that I realised wasn't a feasible, you know, thing to push for. But I certainly do think a treaty is a really good idea, and I'm very pro-treaty. I think that's part of this work we need to do as a nation, but that process will take a decade or more. The voice we can get done. We can get some good policies, procedures and laws happening in the meantime.
To the question of how do you think Aboriginal people would feel hearing it's described as only an advisory body. When I was preparing for this evening, I was thinking about what would hopefully persuade people who are on the verge of voting yes, and then what would hopefully swing people who might be considering voting no. And one of the things I thought about people who might be considering voting no, because a lot of what I've heard is it's going to have veto power, it's going to, you know, have all this power that is not true. So I guess that's what I was trying to assuage people's fears. But as I hope I expressed, I still think it's an extremely important step that Australia needs to take.
Hi, thank you. I'm a very bad public speaker, so bear with me. Firstly, I'd like to thank the church and the community for allowing us the hall to have this, and thank you for the panellists. Look, my concerns are not, I'm a centrist and I'm kind of on the edge at the moment. I haven't made a decision. I have heard a few things that have tweaked my concern that are pushing me more towards no, not because I don't think that the Aboriginal community or people should have this opportunity, but more because of where it could go if it ends up backed by people who have more nefarious ideas later on in the future. So I just wanted to ask you, like, firstly, it goes off the back of what the other gentleman said before. This is obviously about Taylor Reid and Thomas Mayo. Obviously, the support for the Communist Party is a bit of an issue for me. I understand they're from the Aboriginal community, but to me, whether you're part of the Aboriginal community or not, if you're a supporter of the Communist Party, then you don't get my support, period. And some of the things that they've said, she has said that she thinks that we need to get back to the radical roots of the Communist Party. She's also said the voice is a journey with the with all Australians to begin the demolishment of the system that continues to oppress us. And obviously Thomas Mayo said some things about supporting the Communist Party. My question to the panellists is, given already that two prominent individuals that have been involved in this process have clearly shown support for the Communist Party, how can you guarantee the Australian public that an unelected committee of people can't be swayed, backed or run by a group of communists that can then push their ideals on Australia? And I think, as the lady just spoke before, the Aboriginal people don't see this as a token. They don't. And I think it's unfair to suggest this to them as well, you don't really have any rights, but you can say some words. I think that's inappropriate to say that to them and to offer them that to them. If this is going to be something that's offered to them, obviously it's going to have some power behind it. That's the idea behind it, to give Aboriginal people some power to have some say within the government. And I think a lot of people would agree to that. But it confuses me when people are saying, well, it doesn't really have any power. Of course it will have power. We're talking about an entire country of Aboriginals that will come together, and if they say they want something done and the government doesn't take that on and clearly, consider it carefully, there's going to be repercussions.
Thank you very much.
And I just think it's fair that they have that ability, but we're thinking of it in good terms with good people. But times change and people are coerced and taken advantage of, like the Aboriginal people have been forever taken advantage of.
Thank you.
How can we say that the Communist Party are not going to do this to them as well? How can we guarantee that to the Australian people? Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, thank you.
Look, thank you for that question. There's really two parts. I want to deal with the second part first, if I may. What is the power of this body? Is it true that it doesn't have power? The body has an important power. It's a committee with a power to advise. That is the power. It's not a powerless committee. It is a committee with a power to advise government, to advise Parliament about matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's the point of it. It's not a token body. It's one of the reasons that I'm attracted to it. I'm a practical person who wants practical outcomes. I don't like the idea of having a referendum that's just symbolic. Why would we waste all this time and money to just do something that was feel good? This isn't just feel good. It's about making better policies and laws that will lead to better outcomes and better lives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Because as we know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have, sadly, a life expectancy 8 years less than the rest of the community. A suicide rate 2.5 times higher than the rest of the community. An unemployment rate, even in a time of full employment, 9 times higher than the rest of the community. As a country, we are failing in the way that we are dealing with policy relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so I think giving a body the power to give advice to the Parliament and advice to the executive is a really good idea, and it's a reasonable power. On the comments made by Taylor Reid and Thomas Mayo, I want to say this referendum is very different to an election campaign. If Taylor Reid or Thomas Mayo were running against me to be the federal member for Berowra and you were wanting to know what their policy was and they were on the ballot paper, we'd be right to interrogate every word that they said, because they are standing, as I stand every 3 years, as to be your representative in Parliament. But Taylor Reid and Thomas Mayo are not on the ballot paper. I'm not on the ballot paper. Whoever your favourite politician isn't on the ballot paper. Whoever your least favourite politician isn't on the ballot paper. None of us are on the ballot paper. On the ballot paper, on the referendum, is that do we want to make a change to the Constitution or not? That's all. And I think the good sense of the Australian people and the ultimate say that the Parliament has, because the Parliament remains supreme here. The Parliament and the government can choose whether or not to accept the advice of the Voice. And the members of the Voice will ultimately be accountable to those people who are selecting them, and those people who are selecting them are Aboriginal people in communities. And if people who are on the Voice, while you've got suicide rates of the sort I talked about, while you've got educational outcomes that are below the rest of the population, while you've got health outcomes that don't match the rest of the population, if they are chanting the Communist Manifesto at meetings rather than dealing with those problems, I can tell you what's going to happen to them. They're not going to get put on the Voice again, because people will go, what, are you serious? We've got these serious issues in our communities and you're going off dealing with that sort of stuff. So I think the political reality of the good sense of Australia, the good sense of Aboriginal people in communities, plus the Parliament's ultimate power to make changes to the way the Voice operates and to reject the advice of the Voice are the safeguards that ensures that, what you're concerned about with some of the comments that a couple of people have made don't come to pass.
Nathan, would you like to respond?
I don't really have a lot to add, other than I suppose I have heard some people, for example, saying that the interests of those people don't represent my interests. And there's sort of maybe this assumption that people like Teela and Thomas and Megan and Tony McAvoy and others, Sean Gordon, that they will end up being the Voice representatives. I don't believe that's the case. I certainly know Tony, who's a barrister and a KC. He's got a full workload and a busy practice, and he has said he's not interested in being on The Voice. And I think Megan would similarly be busy. And in any event, those selections will happen across the country, including in regional and remote areas. So I don't think either of those people will probably end up actually as a Voice rep. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I've heard Thomas speak. I've heard Tila speak in person. They didn't actually mention anything about the Communist Party or Communist Manifesto. So I'm not actually sure where that's coming from because I hadn't heard that. But yeah, that's probably all I can say.
Thanks. Thank you for your question.
Julian, first, before I ask the question, I want to echo the statements that my friend said earlier. That I'm proud of you. I appreciate what you did. It's a rare thing that we see. But you mentioned in the answer to the last question that you're not on the ballot for this next referendum. If the referendum is not successful, will you be on the ballot next time as a member of the Liberal Party? If so, how?
Well, look, I have some good news for you. I have re-nominated for the next election to be the federal Liberal candidate for Berowra, and I'm the only nominee. The nominations closed yesterday, so if the good people of Berowra choose to vote for me again, I will be your Member of Parliament at the next election.
I don't have a political question. I don't need any convincing about voting yes for lots of reasons. I have an Indigenous brother who was adopted, and you could regard him as part of the stolen generation. And my daughter and her husband and 2 kids have just come back from teaching for 5 years in a remote community. So I don't have any problem in voting yes for lots and lots of reasons. But I don't think we're going to get over the line unless a lot of us, like the people here, start having conversations. And for us to have good conversations with people, we need good information. And I'm in a lot of conversations, perhaps I mix with the wrong sort of people, but some of the stuff that I get is distressing, all right? And some of it is misleading and some of it is blatantly false. And to actually get some information to refute this and have a respectful conversation is sometimes quite difficult. You've got to really, dig around to find something. I found the other day a YouTube video by a lady called Shelley Rays, who's an Indigenous partner of KPMG. Not a consultant of the government, I don't think. And it's a 9-minute video about the yes vote, and it's a fantastic video. But I had to dig around to find it. So I guess I'm interested in where I can find information. You mentioned the NIAA. I get stuff about the NIAA from people who I'm in conversations with all the time about how much money is going to be spent. Is it going to be better value for money, or is it going to be more money? All of those sorts of issues that we've talked about here. So I'm just wondering if there's some central place, or there can be some central place where people can go that they can get information they can use to have a reasonable conversation. The other thing I'd say is I think, from what I get, I think we're losing the social media war. And there is a war going on there in the underground, in TikTok, in Instagram, and all those sorts of things. And I don't know how many of you are involved in that, but again, the stuff that's gurgling around out there is terrible from a yes point of view. And I think somehow we've got to mobilise, particularly younger people who are more into that sort of stuff, to get on and have that conversation and put that information out there. So that's more a statement than anything, but I guess my question is, where can we find the information we need to have the conversations?
That's a great question, and it allows me to put in a bit of an advertisement, if I may. So there's a couple of places that you can go for reliable information. The first is the government's website, voice.gov.au. The second place, if you're inclined to vote yes, or you're trending in that direction and you want the best yes case, it's Yes23, the website for Yes23, which is the sort of national body that is running the yes case. The third thing, and here's the advertisement, just going to point to Paul there, who's up the back. I don't know, can everybody see Paul there? We are establishing an organisation in our community called Berowra Votes Yes. And if you would like to be involved in the Yes campaign, if you'd like to get some more information on how you too can be part of voting yes and inform your friends and so on. Paul has some sheets there that you can fill in, and we'd love you to be part of the campaign, because this isn't like an election campaign. At an election campaign, most people have either made up their mind, do they like their local member or not? Do they like this policy? They're going to vote for Party X because they like the leader, or they like this policy or that policy, or they generally align that way, or they're voting for this candidate because they can't stand the other side and they wouldn't vote for them a month of Sundays, or whatever it is that makes up their mind. There's a whole range of different reasons why you vote for who you vote for at an election. But this is different because we're actually voting on one thing. There's only one topic here, and that is the changing of the Constitution. And so in order to make sure people can make an informed choice about changing the Constitution, they need to be able to find more information. So it's great that that the churches have put on an evening like this tonight, and it's wonderful that so many people have turned up. But if people are going to make an informed choice, they need to be able to read materials, and they need to be able to talk to their friends and find reliable information. And so we need to train people who can explain the arguments to people at street stalls and at campaign events around the country. So if you're interested in being involved, if you feel very passionately about this, or you just want to be better informed, please, before you go tonight, see Paul, and he'll get you to give your details so you can get information about the local Yes campaign and how you can be involved.
I'd probably just say yes, as someone who occasionally engages in social media. There is a lot of misinformation and uninformed commentary and claims that are being made on social media. I can't speak to the motives of people that are saying things that simply aren't true, but there's certainly a lot of it out there. I suppose I encourage people to look up the information. The Calma Langton report is 270 odd pages long. It's a long and tedious thing to wade through, but there's a lot of sort of good grounding information in that document. The website that Julian referred to, certainly the Yes23 website, the Synod's First Nations Resources page has links to some things. The Uniting Church in Australia Assembly website has some frequently asked questions and similar documentation. I would ask people to try and read that information. Don't rely on what you necessarily hear on Facebook or TikTok or YouTube. Be sceptical. Critically think through some of the things that are being said, and sort of ask yourself, does that sound reasonable? Does that sound like it's realistic? That's probably the best advice I can give you, because certainly when I hear some claims, I think, I can't imagine that ever happening. Just think critically. At the end of the day, it's up to each of us to make up our own minds about things, but there is information out there, just think critically about stuff. Thank you.
Another good site is, I think it's called uluru.org.au. Uluru Statement, yeah.
Yep. We're going to come to our last two questions.
Hi, thank you all for coming. More or less following on from that, you hear people say that one of their reservations is about having access to executive government. Can you, please, Julian, would be the most appropriate, cite some of the other groups that have access regularly to executive government for our responses?
Well, it's a really good question, because, as I say, that the main purpose of The Voice is to provide advice to government. So let me talk to you about some of the organisations that regularly provide advice to government. Let's think about things like the Treasury, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Science Officer. All of these bodies regularly, the Productivity Commission, all of these bodies in our system regularly provide advice to the executive government. And the executive government takes that advice, it considers that advice, sometimes it accepts the advice, sometimes it rejects the advice, sometimes it says, oh, we like that idea and not the other idea, and that's entirely appropriate. Because the executive government is made up of parliamentarians, the ministers who are accountable to the parliament and ultimately accountable to you, and it's our job to weigh things up in the national interest. Technical experts might give us some advice, and that might be, very sound technical advice, but there may be other considerations. The Voice will be no different. It will provide advice to governments, it will provide advice to parliaments, and the governments and the parliaments will consider that advice, weigh it up, and work out the way forward.
Sorry, can I just clarify, what about lobbyists? Like the ones you cited were all organisations.
Well, yes, there are also a range of other organisations like peak bodies like the National Farmers Federation or the Business Council of Australia or the Council of Small Business Associations or Greenpeace, or there's a list as long as my arm. If I ran through every single organisation that makes submissions to governments regularly, we'd be here for the next two weeks. But they're not in the Constitution, and you wouldn't want them in the Constitution. But the reason why it's important that the Voice is in the Constitution, and I think this is a really important point, and I'm pleased that Paul raised that issue, is because under our Constitution, there's only one group of people that we make laws about on the basis of their race. Most of the laws that we make in the federal parliament are laws of general application to all Australians. But there are a series of laws that we make that are specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. We make no specific laws for Greek Australians. We make no specific laws for Italian Australians. We make no specific laws for Jewish Australians or Sikh Australians or Australians who are adherents to the Uniting Church. But we do make specific laws relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as a result of making those laws, it is reasonable that as part of the process of making those laws, that those people who are affected by the law should be consulted on them, and that should be something that is enshrined in our Constitution, in my view.
Thanks, everybody. I'm erring on the side of yes, vote, but I want to vote the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want me to vote, and I've heard differing opinions from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, are any of you Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples? Right? And you're obviously wearing a yes shirt, so don't need to make a decision about that. But what are the percentages of people that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are saying yes versus no? Because I can't vote for them, I can't speak for them, but I'm being asked to. And I want to vote in the way they want me to vote. So, is there data that tells me what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want from the rest of Australia?
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a few things in this. The first is that there have been a couple of polls of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the support for the yes vote has ranged from about 80% through 83, and I think there was one that was 86. Even with a margin for error, still generally speaking, the majority of Aboriginal people are in favour of the yes vote. But I really want to talk about some of the reasons I know why some Aboriginal people are not supportive of the Voice. I think it's important. And out of all the reasons I've heard, in some senses, these are the most legitimate for me. Some Aboriginal people have a view that they simply don't trust the government because their lived experience is that government has said one thing and done another many, many times. Government has said many times, trust us, this will be good for you, and it hasn't been. And I would give as an example the Northern Territory intervention. So that's one reason. And I get that. I understand that hesitancy and that wariness. Another reason is because some Aboriginal people think that treaty should be first. This voice, this non-binding voice, that's not really anything. We want a treaty. And I also understand that because our mob have been fighting for treaty for decades and decades, almost since we knew what one was. We've been asking for one. We didn't get a treaty initially because of the use of the doctrine of terra nullius, which says it was a land belonging to no one. And of course, common sense says you can't have a treaty with people you pretend aren't here. Post-Mabo, doctrine of terra nullius has been described as a legal fiction, so we now know that obviously there were people here, and we can get to that point of going, yeah, let's have a treaty. New Zealand's got one, every other Commonwealth country in the world's got one, we can do this. So I get that position as well, I understand that. I think there's legitimacy to that. The other position that some people are taking is that I would probably describe it as a bit of a conspiracy theory, but there is information being distributed on social media where people are claiming that including Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution will result in the ceding of First Peoples sovereignty. I don't believe that at all. But I understand the fear of that. I understand that some people, if they hear this, they might be really scared about that, because obviously sovereignty is a big thing. So I get the legitimacy of that fear. But let me give you a little quick anecdote. We like New Zealand, right? We've got the Anzac tradition, they're just over the ditch. Good people. New Zealanders are good people. If our parliament, our government decided that one day we'd like to give New Zealanders a voice, to be able to give some advice to our government about, and our parliament about how we engage with New Zealand, and we have a referendum to give New Zealand a voice, and the referendum passes, could the Australian government the next day say to New Zealand, oh, by the way, you've just ceded your sovereignty to us, thanks very much? Of course they couldn't. Of course they couldn't, because that's not how the law works. You know, we wouldn't have armed conflict if it was just a matter of having a referendum and taking over someone's sovereignty. So I do get the fear. I think it's a reasonable fear if you're hearing that stuff and you don't get the legal stuff. But in my opinion, it's not a realistic fear. So there's some of the reasons why some Aboriginal people aren't supportive of the voice. There's probably others. And you know, we're not one homogenous people that all think the same. We have different views on all sorts of different things, and that's okay.
I just would add to that if you haven't read the whole Uluru Statement, I really encourage you to read that statement, because it's an invitation to all Australian people to walk alongside Indigenous people, to walk along together. I forgot to show my very last slide, but it's my favourite photo of some of the people from my church and the people from the Minyeri church just walking along together up a road towards the sunset. And I think that's the Uluru Statement is simply saying we are, and it's a very, very gracious invitation. It could be a lot angrier, but it's a gracious invitation to all of us to say, hey, let's walk alongside, let's do this together. And I do understand the fears of some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples because of our history. But yeah, I highly recommend reading the statement or listening to it on the Uluru Statement site if you haven't already.
Martin, I look at you that look like we're about to wrap up. I just wondered if I might offer one quick reflection. In 1967, 90% of Australians, just think about that, 90% of Australians voted yes to give the federal government the power to make law, the federal parliament, the power to make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. It'd be hard to get 90% of Australians today to agree on the time of day. But what's interesting about the referendum in 1967 is what we did in this part of Sydney, in this community. The Barara electorate didn't exist in 1967, it came into being 2 years later. But in the booths that make up the Barara electorate, in no booth was the vote lower than the national average. There were booths where 92 and 97% and 98% of people voted yes. I don't think we're going to get that result at this referendum, but what I hope in our community is that we continue the trend of voting yes higher than the national average and continue being a light to the rest of the country in terms of the way we work together for a reconciled Australia.
Please do, thank you. We've come to the end of this section of our forum tonight, but there's a third section, and the third section is going to be in that room just over there. And it's going to include what has to happen every time you come into a church, and that is to have a cup of tea and have a conversation. So please do stay if you are able to come and join us for a cup of tea. Our panelists will continue to be with us in the midst of that as well. But it gives me the opportunity also then to say thank you to the panelists, to thank you for their openness, for their willingness to share, and for you coming along on this cold winter's night to come and to share your perspectives. And I think from what I heard in the question time, there's an emotion around this. There's a concern around some of these questions, and rightly. My concern particularly tonight is that I'm one of the younger people in the room. Now, look, in the Uniting Church, I get used to that. But in terms of the Normanhurst, Hornsby, Thornley environment, that's not the case. I would actually be seen, in terms of my grey, a little bit older. So for me, you part of the process here, in terms of actually speaking to the generation that's not here, by and large, tonight, to actually talk to them about some of this as well. Because for some of them, I know certainly for my own son, this will be his first time ever voting at all in anything in Australia, will be for this referendum. And so the thing that has happened for me is that I've had conversations with him about that. And can I encourage you to go and have those conversations? Part of what we said earlier is that there's so much disinformation, there's so much misinformation happening. We've heard, sorry to say this from the horse's mouth, no, but we've heard from those who are directly involved in all kinds of ways in terms of this process. We've heard honest understanding in terms of process. There's some things we can't answer. There's some things we don't know what will exactly be. But we do know that, in fact, what we're changing is one thing in the Constitution, which I love the way what Julian said, was that it completes some of the Constitution. I personally think, though, that he might be optimistic to say that that's the end, because I think there might be some other gaps we might find as the process continues. But this is one that we can fill now. We can do something about this now. And it's only going to happen if we actually start sharing the information that we've had. So for those of you who are good with TikTok, off you go. And for the others, as Jim said at the beginning of this process, that I've got an accent which doesn't quite connect with the Australian, although South Africans think it does. The reality of it is that I saw the change happen in South Africa. I left South Africa at the end of 1994. The election took place in April of that year. And I saw the new constitution that South Africa was based under, which allowed Nelson Mandela to become the first president of colour, if you want to call him that, in South Africa. And I was there for that process. And the one thing that I loved about that process was that most people said it was impossible. It would never happen. But not only did it happen, but it changed the whole fabric of that country. You know, I think one of the biggest changes that this will bring is a change in perspective. More than anything else, a change in perspective. And that change in perspective ripples through every part of the community and will ripple through every part. And not only our community, I believe will ripple through the First Nations around the world. And so I think it actually is a moment, a kairos moment, a particular moment in time for us to do something for this. And so I encourage you, let's share that information. If we say there's so much misinformation and disinformation, well, let's not become peddlers thereof. Instead, let's seek to actually find the information and to share that well. So thank you for coming. Thank you for our panelists who shared openly and well with us tonight, and we really appreciate it. And we're going to give them a gift, and Maggie's going to give that to them. And it's a kangaroo paw. I always find that giving a gift that's alive is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Let's thank them again. And so as we go from this place, may you go, oh, I get one too? I didn't do anything. I just talked. Thank you very much. Can I say from my perspective is to say, I pray that you have a blessed week, a blessed month, a blessed year, and most of all, that in fact that you share that love and that connection with us as a community, and we can continue to do so with each other. So join us for a cup of tea or coffee, and please continue the conversation. Thank you very much for coming.